On my son's wedding day, my daughter-in-law shaved my head while I was sleeping and left a note humiliating me. Before continuing the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you won't miss more stories, and leave your like on the video. I woke up that morning feeling like something was terribly wrong. My scalp felt cold, exposed in a way I'd never experienced before. As I reached up to touch my hair, the silver waves I'd been growing out for months in preparation for my son's wedding, my fingers met nothing but bare skin. Nothing. I stumbled to the bathroom mirror, and the reflection that stared back at me was a stranger, completely bald, not a single strand left. My head looked like someone had taken clippers to it while I slept, which, I realized with growing horror, is exactly what had happened. On my nightstand, folded neatly beside my reading glasses, was a piece of hotel stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, my future daughter-in-law's precise, careful script that I'd seen on thank you cards and grocery lists. "Dear mother-in-law," it read, "I thought you might want to match the other old, worn-out things at the wedding today. Consider this my gift to you. Now you finally look as worthless as you've always been. Don't even think about wearing a wig or hat. I want everyone to see exactly what you are. Your loving daughter-in-law." I sat on the edge of my bed, holding that note with trembling hands. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Watching my only child, my boy, marry the woman he claimed to love. I'd planned everything so carefully. The pale blue dress hanging in my closet, chosen specifically to complement her color scheme. The pearl earrings my late husband had given me, which I'd planned to gift to her as a family tradition. And the surprise I'd been preparing for months, the wedding gift that would secure their future forever. But as I stared at my reflection, running my palm over my smooth scalp, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about vanity or appearance. This was cruelty, calculated and deliberate. She had crept into my room while I slept, vulnerable and trusting, and violated me in the most intimate way possible. I'd been making excuses for her behavior for 3 years now. The subtle insults disguised as concern, the way she'd slowly turned my son against me, poisoning our once close relationship with whispered complaints about my interference. The holidays where I felt like an unwelcome guest in my own home. But this crossed every line. I picked up my phone and called the front desk of the hotel where the wedding party was staying. "I need a taxi to take me to a beauty supply store," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And then to the church. I have a wedding to attend." No, I wouldn't hide. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of my absence or my shame. If she wanted everyone to see me bald, then that's exactly what they would see. But they'd also see something else, a woman who refused to be broken. As I dressed carefully in my blue dress, fastening my pearl earrings with steady hands, I thought about that envelope in my purse downstairs, the one containing the papers for the most generous wedding gift I could imagine. Maybe it was time to reconsider that particular surprise. As I waited for the taxi, memories flooded back like scenes from an old movie. 33 years ago, I was a different woman entirely. Young, devastated, and suddenly alone with a 2-year-old boy who kept asking for his daddy. My husband had been everything to me. We'd married young, built dreams together, planned a future that stretched out like an endless summer. When the heart attack took him at 35, I thought my world had ended. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, but what I remember most clearly was the moment everyone left and I was alone with my son, staring at a stack of medical bills and a mortgage I had no idea how to pay. I had exactly $347 in our checking account and a business degree I'd never used, but I had something else, a fierce, protective love for that little boy who looked so much like his father. He would not grow up poor. He would not want for anything. I would make sure of it, no matter what it cost me. I started small, cleaning offices at night after my son went to sleep, leaving him with my elderly neighbor who refused payment but accepted my homemade meals in return. During the day, I took business courses at the community college, pushing a stroller to classes when I couldn't find childcare. By the time my son turned 5, I'd saved enough to buy my first rental property, a run-down duplex that I renovated myself. learning plumbing and electrical work from library books and YouTube videos that didn't exist yet. My hands were always dirty then, always cut up from some repair project, but I was building something. One duplex became 2, then 4. I learned to read markets, to spot neighborhoods on the verge of transformation. I bought low, improved everything, sold high. My son grew up on construction sites, doing homework in property management offices, falling asleep to the sound of me making late-night calls to contractors and tenants. He never complained, not once. Even as a teenager, when other kids were embarrassed by their parents' jobs, he bragged about his mom, who owned half the city. He'd bring friends around to see the latest renovation project, proud as if I'd built skyscrapers instead of fixing bathroom tiles. "Mom," he'd say, hugging me tight after a particularly long day, "you're like a superhero, but instead of saving people from bad guys, you save them from bad landlords." Those were the golden years. Just the two of us against the world, partners in every sense. I taught him about business, about treating people fairly, about working hard for what you wanted. He helped me see properties through young eyes, suggesting improvements I never would have considered. By his 18th birthday, my little real estate empire was worth $15 million. By his college graduation, $35 million. Today, at 65, I'm worth more than I ever dreamed possible. All built from that first duplex and the desperate love of a widowed mother who refused to let her child suffer. I did it for him. Every sleepless night, every risk, every sacrifice. I wanted to hand him a future without struggle, without the fear that had driven me for decades. The taxi honked outside, pulling me back to the present moment. I looked at myself one last time in the hotel mirror, bald, dignified, and suddenly seeing clearly for the first time in years. All those sacrifices, all that success, and this is how my son's future wife chooses to treat me. As if I were nothing more than an obstacle to be humiliated and discarded. Maybe it was time she learned exactly who she was dealing with. She entered our lives like a perfectly polished weapon, disguised as a gift. I met her 3 years ago at my son's company Christmas party, beautiful, charming, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was 28 to his 31, an account executive at a marketing firm with an impressive resume and an even more impressive ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear. "Mrs. Johnson," she said that first night, taking my hands in hers with practiced warmth, "I've heard so much about you. Your son absolutely worships you. It's actually quite adorable how he talks about his amazing mother." I should have paid attention to that word. Adorable. As if my relationship with my adult son was something quaint and childish, rather than the bond forged through decades of mutual respect and shared struggles. The early signs were subtle. She'd suggest restaurants she knew I couldn't afford on dates when my son invited me along, then act surprised when I declined. "Oh, I forgot not everyone is comfortable with fine dining," she'd say with a little laugh that felt like a blade between the ribs. She had a gift for making her cruelty sound like concern. "I worry that your mother might be a little too involved in your life," I overheard her telling my son one evening. "It's sweet, but don't you think it's time to establish some boundaries? For her sake, really, she needs to develop her own interests, my own interests." As if building a business empire while raising a child alone hadn't required enough interests to last several lifetimes. But the worst part was watching my son change. The weekly dinners we'd shared for years became monthly, then sporadic. The long phone calls where he'd tell me about his day, ask for advice, share his dreams, those disappeared entirely. When I'd call him, she was always there in the background, and his responses became clipped, distracted. "Mom, you need to understand that I'm building a life with her now," he said, during one particularly painful conversation. "You can't expect to be the most important woman in my life anymore." I wanted to scream that I'd never asked to be the most important woman in his life. I'd only wanted to remain important at all. But she'd convinced him that loving his mother was somehow a betrayal of loving her, as if the heart were a zero-sum game where someone had to lose. She moved into his apartment 6 months after they met, and suddenly I needed an invitation to visit my own son. She'd rearrange the furniture I'd helped him pick out, replace photos of us with pictures of her friends, suggest that maybe I was calling too much when I tried to maintain our old closeness. The engagement came 18 months later. They didn't tell me. I found out when she posted it on social media with the caption, "Finally found my forever person. Can't wait to start our new life together." No mention of family, no acknowledgement that this new life would include anyone but the two of them. When my son finally called to share the news officially, his voice carried a strange mixture of excitement and guilt. "We wanted to tell you first, Mom, but things have been so crazy with the proposal and everything." Everything, I discovered, meant a weekend trip to Paris, where he'd proposed at the top of the Eiffel Tower, funded, I later learned, by a loan against the trust fund I'd established for his future. She'd convinced him they deserved a fairy tale engagement, and that I would understand why they needed to borrow against his inheritance for something so special. Planning the wedding became an exercise in exclusion disguised as inclusion. Every suggestion I made was politely dismissed. Every tradition I hoped to maintain was outdated or not really our style. When I offered to pay for elements of the ceremony, she insisted they wanted to do this on their own, except for the parts my son's trust fund would cover. "I just think it's important that this day reflects who we are as a couple," she explained with that practiced smile. "Not who his family wants us to be. His family." As if I were some distant relative instead of the woman who'd built everything he had, who'd sacrificed everything for his success, who loved him more than her own life. But today, sitting in this taxi on the way to my son's wedding, bald and betrayed, I finally understood what I'd been too naive to see before. She'd never intended to welcome me into their family. She'd been systematically removing me from my son's life, piece by piece, relationship by relationship. This morning's cruelty wasn't an impulsive act of wedding day stress. It was the final step in a 3-year campaign to erase me completely. The envelope in my purse felt heavier than it should, containing papers that represented the most generous gesture I'd ever planned to make. $120 million. The majority of my life's work, carefully structured through my attorneys to transfer to the newlyweds as a wedding gift. I'd spent 3 months planning this surprise, working with tax specialists and financial advisors to ensure the transfer would be as smooth as possible. The money would come with only one condition: that they use it wisely and remember the love that made it possible. It had seemed like the perfect solution to all our family tensions. How could she continue to resent me when I was literally handing them a fortune? How could she claim I was trying to control their lives when I was giving them complete financial freedom? My lawyers had tried to talk me out of it, of course. "Mrs. Johnson," my lead attorney had said during our final meeting last week, "this is an extraordinary gift. Perhaps consider starting smaller or structuring it as a gradual transfer over several years." But I'd been resolute. "I'm 65 years old," I'd told him. "I've spent 33 years building this wealth, and I don't want to take it to my grave. My son deserves to enjoy it while he's young enough to truly benefit from it." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. During the reception toasts, I would stand and announce my gift to the couple. It would be the highlight of the entire celebration, the moment when I proved that despite all our difficulties, family love conquered everything. I'd even rehearsed my speech. "My dear son and beautiful daughter-in-law," I would begin, "love is the greatest investment any of us can make. Today, I want to invest in your future together." Then I'd hand them the legal documents, watch their faces transform with joy and gratitude, and finally, be welcomed fully into the family I'd longed to be part of. The irony wasn't lost on me now, sitting in this taxi with my scalp still stinging from her attack. I'd been prepared to give them everything, and she'd responded by trying to take away my dignity, my appearance, my very sense of self. But there was something else that made this betrayal cut even deeper. In all my planning, in all my hopes for reconciliation, I'd somehow convinced myself that this gift would change who she was. That enough generosity could transform cruelty into kindness. That enough love could overcome calculated malice. I'd been thinking like the grieving young widow I once was, desperate to buy security and acceptance for my child. But I wasn't that powerless woman anymore. And my son wasn't that innocent little boy who needed my protection. The taxi pulled up to the beauty supply store, and I instructed the driver to wait. Inside, I purchased the most elegant headscarf I could find, deep blue silk that matched my dress perfectly. not to hide my baldness, but to frame it with dignity. As I tied the scarf carefully around my head, I caught my reflection in the store's mirror. I looked like a woman who'd survived something, which I realized was exactly what I was. That envelope in my purse, those papers that could change their lives forever, suddenly felt like a test I'd been on the verge of failing. Not a test of my generosity, but of my wisdom, of my ability to see people clearly instead of seeing who I wished they could be. My son had made his choice 3 years ago, when he allowed this woman to systematically remove me from his life. Today's cruelty was just the logical conclusion of a campaign I'd been too heartbroken to acknowledge. As we drove toward the church, I thought about all the ways I'd planned to announce that gift, the joy I'd imagined seeing on their faces, the gratitude I'd expected, the family harmony I'd thought money could buy. But sitting there with my bald head wrapped in silk, I wondered if there might be a better use for that envelope, a more fitting response to this morning's revelation about who these people really were and what they actually thought of me. The church was bustling with pre-ceremony chaos when I arrived. I'd deliberately come early, wanting to find a quiet moment with my son before the festivities began. Despite everything, despite this morning's brutal wake-up call, part of me still hoped for some explanation, some sign that the boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere. I found him in the vestry, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. For a moment, seeing him in his black tuxedo, he looked exactly like his father on our wedding day, handsome, anxious, full of hope for the future. "Mom," he said, turning toward me, and I watched his face register shock at my appearance. "What happened to your hair?" Before I could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, guilty panic mixed with excitement. "I need to take this," he said, stepping away from me. "It's about work." But I could hear enough of the conversation to know it wasn't about work at all. "Are you sure we can do this without anyone finding out?" he said in a low voice, thinking the ambient noise of the church would cover his words. "The timing has to be perfect. Yes, I know we talked about waiting until after the honeymoon, but Mom's gift changes everything. We could be on a plane to Switzerland by tomorrow night." Switzerland. My son was planning to leave the country immediately after his wedding, and he was discussing it with someone who clearly wasn't his bride-to-be. "Listen," he continued, turning further away from me. "Once we get the money transferred, we can start the paperwork for the house in Geneva. She'll never suspect anything until it's too late. I know it's risky, but it's our only chance to be together without all this family drama." He was talking about another woman entirely. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. The emotional distance over the past 3 years hadn't just been about my future daughter-in-law's influence. My son had been living a double life, planning an escape from the very marriage he was about to enter into. "The nursing home paperwork is already completed," he continued, not realizing I could hear every word. "Once she signs over the assets, we can have her committed for her own safety. The lawyers say her age and the stress of losing her hair will be enough to demonstrate diminished capacity." Nursing home. Diminished capacity. They'd planned this morning's attack as evidence that I was losing my mind. My legs felt weak. I sank into a nearby chair, trying to process what I was hearing. My son, my beloved son, for whom I'd sacrificed everything, was planning to steal my money, abandon his new wife, and have me declared mentally incompetent so he could access my entire estate. "I love you too," he whispered into the phone before hanging up. "Just a few more hours and we'll be free." He turned back to me with that familiar smile, the one that had melted my heart 1,000 times throughout his childhood. But now I saw it for what it truly was, a mask he'd learned to wear whenever he needed something from me. "Sorry about that, Mom. You know how crazy wedding days can be." He approached me with practiced concern. "Now, what happened to your hair? Did you have some kind of accident this morning?" I stared at my son, this stranger wearing my child's face, and realized that the woman who'd shaved my head while I slept was actually the least of my problems. She was cruel and calculating, yes, but she was exactly what she appeared to be. My son, on the other hand, had spent years perfecting a deception that made her petty malice look amateur by comparison. "Just a little mishap at the salon," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. "Nothing that can't be fixed." He nodded absently, already distracted by the sounds of guests arriving outside. "Well, you still look beautiful, Mom. Thanks for being here today. I know things have been complicated with her lately, but it means everything to me that you're here. It means everything." The words felt like acid in my ears because I finally understood what they really meant. My presence here wasn't about love or family tradition. I was here to play my role in their elaborate con game, the generous mother of the groom who would sign over her fortune and then quietly disappear into institutional care. As he left to greet the guests, I sat alone in that vestry, surrounded by flowers and candles and all the trappings of a holy ceremony, understanding for the first time that I'd raised a stranger. The boy who used to hold my hand and call me his superhero had grown into a man who could plan my destruction with the same casual efficiency he once brought to school projects. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that a lonely old woman would be too desperate for family connection to see their manipulation clearly. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. I needed air. The vestry felt suffocating after what I'd just overheard. So I stepped outside the church's side door into the small garden where wedding parties often took photos. That's when I heard her voice, sharp and triumphant, coming from behind a cluster of rose bushes. "Did you see her this morning?" she was saying into her phone. "Bald as a baby bird. The old fool probably thinks it was some kind of accident." I moved closer, hidden by the stone wall that separated the garden from the parking area. She was pacing back and forth, completely unaware of my presence. No, the hair thing was just for fun," she continued, laughing at whatever response she was receiving. "The real plan starts after the ceremony. I've already got the divorce papers drawn up. I just need to wait exactly 6 months to establish community property rights. California law, you know. Half of everything becomes mine the moment I file. Half of everything." She was talking about the money I'd planned to give them as a wedding gift. "The beauty of it is that neither of them suspects what the other is planning," she said, her voice filled with genuine amusement. "He thinks I'm going to be the perfect little wife while he runs off with his secretary. I think he's going to be the devoted husband while I clean out his accounts. Meanwhile, the old lady thinks she's buying family harmony with her little fortune. Her little fortune. $120 million was apparently pocket change to someone planning this level of deception. The nursing home angle is brilliant, though. I have to give him credit for that. Once she's declared incompetent, I can claim spousal rights to contest any financial decision she makes. Between his inheritance and her assets, we're talking about enough money to last several lifetimes." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not heartbreak this time, but something harder and more focused. Clarity. "Oh, and get this," she continued, clearly enjoying herself. "She actually thinks I'm going to change after today. She has no idea that I've spent 3 years documenting every sign of her declining mental state. The hair obsession, the excessive phone calls, the inappropriate financial decisions. My lawyer says we have enough evidence to support a conservatorship hearing." A conservatorship. They weren't just planning to steal my money. They were planning to have me declared legally incompetent so they could control every aspect of my life. The morning's humiliation hadn't been random cruelty. It was evidence building for a legal case they'd been constructing for years. "The timeline is perfect," she was saying now. 6 months gives me enough time to establish legal residence, document the inheritance, and then file for divorce claiming irreconcilable differences and emotional abuse. He'll be so busy running around Europe with his girlfriend that he won't even see it coming until the papers are served. So she knew about the secretary too. This wasn't a triangle of deception. It was a carefully orchestrated plan where each party thought they were manipulating the others, while she was actually playing both sides. By this time next year, I'll own half of one of the largest private real estate portfolios in the state, and she'll be safely tucked away in a memory care facility where she can't interfere with anyone's life ever again. Memory care. They'd decided I had dementia without even the courtesy of a medical diagnosis. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly moved back toward the church entrance. She was finishing her call, her voice taking on that sweet, innocent tone I'd come to recognize as her performance voice. "I should go," she said. "Time to play the blushing bride. Wish me luck taking down 2 generations of the same family in one day." As I slipped back inside the church, I caught a glimpse of her through the window, smoothing her white dress, checking her makeup in her phone camera, transforming herself back into the radiant bride who would fool everyone except the 3 people who mattered most. But she'd made the same mistake my son had made. She'd assumed that I was nothing more than a lonely old woman, desperate enough for family connection to ignore obvious warning signs and generous enough to hand over my life's work without asking questions. She had no idea that the woman she was planning to destroy had spent 33 years outmaneuvering people who underestimated her, that I hadn't built a fortune by being naive about human nature, and I certainly hadn't kept it by failing to recognize threats to everything I'd worked for. The wedding was about to begin, and I had a decision to make. I could play my assigned role, the generous mother of the groom who would smile and hand over her fortune and then quietly disappear into whatever institution they'd selected for me. Or I could remind them both why you should never underestimate a woman who's spent decades turning nothing into everything, and who's never lost a fight that truly mattered. I walked back into the church with purpose, my phone already in my hand. The first call I needed to make was to my attorney, but I had to be strategic about the timing. The ceremony was starting in 20 minutes, and I needed to act fast while maintaining the appearance of the devoted mother of the groom. I found a quiet corner near the baptismal font and dialed my lawyer's direct line. "Richard, it's me," I said when he answered. "I need you to stop the transfer immediately." "Which transfer?" he asked, though I could hear the concern in his voice. Richard had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, and he'd never heard me sound quite like this. "The wedding gift. The $120 million we structured for the newlyweds. Cancel it. Now." There was a long pause. "Are you sure? Once I make that call, we can't undo it without significant legal complications. The paperwork is already filed." "I'm absolutely certain. And Richard, I need you to do something else. I want you to record our conversation right now, timestamp it, and file it as evidence of my mental competency. Can you ask me some questions that would demonstrate clear thinking?" He didn't ask why, which is one of the reasons I'd kept him as my attorney for so long. "What's today's date?" "Saturday, June 15th, 2024. It's my son's wedding day." "What's your full legal name and date of birth?" I provided the information clearly and precisely. "Can you explain your reasoning for canceling this significant financial transfer?" "I've discovered that both the bride and groom have been planning to defraud me of my assets, commit me to a nursing home against my will, and have me declared legally incompetent. They've been building a case for 3 years, and this morning's incident, where the bride shaved my head while I slept, was designed to provide evidence of my declining mental state." "Jesus," Richard muttered. "Okay, I'm stopping the transfer right now. Are you safe?" "I'm fine, but I need one more thing. Can you have someone from your office meet me at the reception venue with divorce papers for the bride? I want them prepared ahead of time, citing fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." "Done." "Anything else?" I looked around the church, watching my son's friends and business associates filing into the pews, all of them expecting to witness a beautiful family celebration. "Can you patch me through to my accountant? I need to make some immediate changes to my will." The changes took 8 minutes to dictate and authorize. Instead of leaving everything to my son as I'd planned for 33 years, I was now establishing a foundation for widowed mothers trying to build businesses. Every penny of my estate would go to women who understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for their children's future, and who deserved better than betrayal as a reward for their love. By the time I finished the calls, the organist had begun playing the prelude music. I walked down the aisle to my designated seat in the front row, nodding graciously to the guests who commented on my beautiful headscarf and asked if I was feeling well. "Just a little styling mishap this morning," I said with a smile. "Nothing that can't be handled." My son appeared at the altar, handsome and confident, checking his watch with the nervousness of a groom eager to begin his new life. He caught my eye and smiled that practiced smile, probably wondering if I'd brought the envelope with the transfer papers he was counting on. I smiled back and patted my purse, letting him think exactly what he wanted to think. The bride appeared at the back of the church a few minutes later, radiant in white silk, carrying a bouquet of white roses that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She looked like every groom's dream, beautiful, elegant, the picture of innocence and joy. As she walked down the aisle toward my son, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard in the garden, about nursing homes and conservatorships and her plan to destroy 2 generations of my family in a single year. The minister began the ceremony with the traditional opening, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of these 2 souls in holy matrimony." Holy matrimony. I almost laughed at the irony, but I kept my face composed, the picture of maternal pride, while I mentally prepared for the moment when I would stand to give my toast at the reception. Because that's when this farce would finally end, and they would discover that their biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating my generosity. It had been underestimating my intelligence. The reception was held at the Riverside Country Club, where I'd hosted my own wedding reception 38 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched my son and his new wife dance their first dance to At Last, the same song his father and I had chosen for our special moment. But unlike my wedding day, filled with genuine joy and hope for the future, this celebration felt like a theatrical performance where everyone was playing a role. The bride smiled and laughed at all the right moments, accepting congratulations from guests who had no idea they were witnessing an elaborate con game. My son played the devoted husband perfectly, spinning her on the dance floor while probably calculating how many hours until he could board a plane to Geneva with his secretary. I sat at the head table, picking at my dinner and making polite conversation with relatives and family friends, all while watching the clock. The toasts were scheduled to begin at 8:30 after the main course. I'd specifically requested to speak last, claiming I wanted to end the evening on the most meaningful note possible. At 8:25, I excused myself to the ladies' room, where I found Richard's associate waiting with a manila envelope as promised. "Everything you requested is here," she said quietly, handing me the papers. Divorce papers citing fraud and conspiracy, plus documentation of the canceled financial transfer. "Your attorney wanted me to tell you that he's never seen anything quite like this situation." "That makes 2 of us," I replied, checking to make sure all the paperwork was in order. When I returned to the reception, the best man was finishing his toast, something generic about love conquering all and wishing the happy couple a lifetime of joy. The guests applauded politely, and then the maid of honor stood to offer her equally predictable speech about how perfect they were together. Finally, the DJ announced, "And now, we'd like to invite the mother of the groom to share a few words." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. 150 guests, including my son's business colleagues, childhood friends, and extended family members who'd traveled from across the country to celebrate this union. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. 33 years ago, I became a widow with a 2-year-old son and $300 to my name. Everything I built after that day was for him, for the man sitting at this table who I raised to value honesty, integrity, and family loyalty above all else. My son smiled nervously and reached for his water glass. His new wife maintained her radiant expression, though I noticed her grip tighten slightly on her champagne flute. "I've learned some fascinating things today about the people my son has chosen to surround himself with," I continued, pulling the manila envelope from my purse. "For instance, I learned that my beautiful daughter-in-law has such strong opinions about my appearance that she felt compelled to shave my head while I slept this morning, leaving me a note calling me worthless and demanding I display my humiliation for all of you to see." A collective gasp went through the room. Several guests turned to stare at the bride, whose smile finally began to crack. "I also learned," I said, my voice growing stronger, "that my son has been having an affair with his secretary for 8 months, and they've been planning to take the wedding gift I prepared for this couple and flee to Switzerland immediately after tonight's celebration." My son's face went white. He started to stand, but I held up my hand. "Please, let me finish. I also discovered that my daughter-in-law has already consulted a divorce attorney and plans to file papers in exactly 6 months to claim half of any assets transferred to this marriage. Meanwhile, both of them have been working together to have me declared mentally incompetent so they can commit me to a nursing home and gain control of my entire estate." The room was completely silent now, except for the sound of chair legs scraping as guests turned to get better views of the head table. Several people had their phones out, recording what was clearly going to be the most memorable wedding reception speech in family history. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, opening the envelope and removing the papers inside. "First, the $120 million wedding gift I prepared for you has been canceled. The transfer was stopped at 4:15 this afternoon and will never be reinstated." My son lurched to his feet. "Mom, what are you—" "Second," I continued, ignoring his interruption, "my will has been changed. Instead of inheriting my estate, my son will receive exactly $1, along with a letter explaining that this amount reflects the value he's placed on our relationship. The remainder of my fortune will establish a foundation supporting widowed mothers who are building businesses to support their children." The bride was no longer even pretending to smile. Her face had gone from flushed to pale, and she was gripping the table edge with both hands. "And finally," I said, walking around the table to stand directly in front of her, "these are divorce papers. I'm filing them on your behalf, citing fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The papers include evidence of this morning's assault on my person, recordings of your phone conversations planning this elaborate scheme, and testimony regarding your husband's extramarital affair." I placed the papers directly in front of her plate, next to her untouched wedding cake. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before my son found his voice. "This is insane," he said, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Mom, you can't just—" "Actually, I can," I replied calmly. "And I have. Your marriage is based on fraud from both parties, which makes it voidable under state law. Your wife assaulted me this morning, which makes her subject to criminal charges. And your plan to steal my money and have me committed constitutes elder abuse, which is a felony." I looked around the room at the shocked faces of all the guests, people who'd come expecting to celebrate love and family, only to witness the complete destruction of both. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," I said, addressing the room one final time. "You've been witnesses to something important. The moment when an old woman who's been underestimated her entire life finally decided to stop pretending she didn't see what was happening to her." I picked up my purse and headed for the exit, leaving behind a room full of stunned guests and two people whose carefully planned future had just disintegrated in front of everyone they knew. I walked out of that country club into the warm evening air, leaving behind the chaos I'd just unleashed. Through the windows, I could see guests clustered in animated groups, phones out, undoubtedly sharing the drama they'd just witnessed with friends and family who hadn't been fortunate enough to attend what would surely become legendary as the most spectacular wedding disaster in local history. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached my car. The first call was from my son, then his new wife, then numbers I didn't recognize, probably other family members who'd already heard secondhand accounts of what had transpired. I turned the phone off and drove home in blessed silence. The house felt different when I walked through the door. For the first time in 3 years, it felt like mine again. No more walking on eggshells, wondering what I'd said or done to offend my son's girlfriend. No more pretending not to notice the way she rolled her eyes when I spoke or suggested activities that excluded me. No more making excuses for behavior that had been inexcusable from the very beginning. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, finally allowing myself to process what had actually happened today. This morning I'd awakened as a woman, planning to give away most of her fortune to secure her place in her son's life. Tonight, I was sitting alone in my house, having effectively severed that relationship forever. But strangely, I didn't feel the devastating grief I'd expected. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The doorbell rang around 10 o'clock. I looked through the peephole and saw my son standing on the front porch, still wearing his tuxedo, his hair disheveled, and his face streaked with what might have been tears. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "How could you do this to me?" he said immediately, his voice breaking. "How could you destroy my wedding, humiliate me in front of everyone I know, and take away everything you promised me?" "I didn't promise you anything," I replied calmly. "I was planning to give you a gift, which I discovered you intended to steal while having me declared incompetent. There's a significant difference." "You don't understand," he said, stepping closer. "I wasn't really going to go through with it. The Switzerland thing, the nursing home, it was just talk. I was confused, scared about getting married. I would never actually hurt you. I studied my son's face, looking for any trace of the boy I'd raised, the child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me I was the bravest person in the world. But all I saw was a 31-year-old man who'd been caught in an elaborate deception and was now trying to manipulate his way out of the consequences. You spent 8 months planning an escape route with another woman, I said. You allowed your fiancé to systematically remove me from your life over 3 years. You discussed having me committed to a memory care facility and taking control of my assets. Which part of that was just talk? She poisoned me against you, he said desperately. She made me think you were trying to control my life, that you'd never let me be happy with anyone else. I see now that she was manipulating both of us. It was almost funny how quickly he'd pivoted to making himself the victim of his wife's manipulation, as if he'd been some innocent bystander in a scheme he'd actively participated in planning. Where is your wife now? I asked. He looked uncomfortable. She left. After the reception fell apart, she just disappeared, took her things from the hotel and left town. I don't even know where she went. So his partner in crime had abandoned ship the moment their plan collapsed, leaving him to face the consequences alone. I wasn't surprised. People who could plan this level of deception rarely showed loyalty when things went wrong. I need that money, Mom, he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I hadn't heard since he was a teenager asking for car privileges. I quit my job last month because I thought I'd have the inheritance. I've got debts, obligations. Without that gift, I'm going to lose everything. There it was. Not an apology for the betrayal, not remorse for the pain he'd caused, but a demand that I rescue him from the consequences of his own choices. You're 31 years old, I said. You have a business degree, work experience, and no dependents. You'll figure it out the same way I did when I was widowed with a child to support. I started to close the door, but he put his hand against it. Please, he said. I'm your son, your only family. You can't just cut me off completely. I looked at him one more time, this stranger wearing my child's face, and felt the last thread of maternal obligation finally snap. You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be loved, I said. I raised a son who would never treat anyone the way you've treated me, especially not the woman who sacrificed everything for his future. I don't know who you've become, but you're not that boy anymore. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, listening to him call my name through the wood before finally walking away. The first few weeks after the wedding were a whirlwind of legal activity. Richard filed the criminal complaints against both my son and his wife for conspiracy to commit elder abuse and financial exploitation. The police investigation uncovered text message chains and email evidence that supported everything I'd discovered, including detailed discussions about which nursing home would be easiest to manage and how to time the conservatorship proceedings for maximum effectiveness. My son's wife had indeed disappeared, but not without leaving a trail. She'd cleaned out their joint checking account on her way out of town, taking the remains of his trust fund and the money he'd borrowed against future inheritance. The private investigator Richard hired found her in Miami, apparently moving on to her next target, a recently widowed real estate developer she'd met through an online dating app specifically designed for wealthy seniors. My son tried calling me daily for the first month, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that progressed from anger to bargaining to what sounded like genuine remorse. But I'd learned the difference between regret over consequences and actual accountability for actions, and his messages fell squarely into the first category. Mom, I know I messed up, one typical message said, but you have to understand the pressure I was under. She convinced me that you were trying to control my life, that the only way to be happy was to put some distance between us. I see now that she was playing us against each other, but you can't hold me responsible for falling for her manipulation. Even in his apologies, he couldn't take responsibility for his own choices. Everything was something that had happened to him, not decisions he'd actively made. The affair with his secretary was because his fiancée was emotionally distant. The plan to steal my money was because he'd been financially pressured. The nursing home scheme was because he'd been convinced I needed professional care. After 6 weeks of ignored calls and unreturned messages, He showed up at my house again, this time looking genuinely desperate. He'd lost weight, his clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. "I'm going to lose the apartment," he said when I reluctantly agreed to speak with him through the screen door. "I can't find another job because the story about the wedding is all over social media. Everyone in town knows what happened." I felt a tiny flicker of the old maternal instinct, the desire to fix his problems and make his pain go away. But then I remembered the conversation I'd overheard about nursing homes and diminished capacity, and the feeling passed. "Have you considered leaving town?" I asked. "Starting fresh somewhere that your reputation isn't damaged?" "With what money?" he said bitterly. "You took away everything I was counting on." "I took away money that was never yours to begin with," I corrected. "Money you were planning to steal from me after having me declared mentally incompetent." "I was never going to actually do that," he insisted. But the protest sounded hollow, even to him. The truth was, I'd been watching the transformation in my son for 3 years without wanting to acknowledge what I was seeing. The gradual shift from a young man who valued family relationships to someone who saw me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. His wife hadn't created that change. She'd simply encouraged and amplified something that was already there. "I'm starting a new life," I told him through the screen. "I've sold the business, I'm selling this house, and I'm moving somewhere I can focus on my own happiness instead of trying to fix relationships with people who don't value them." "You can't be serious," he said. "This is your home. Your whole life is here." "My whole life was about building something for you," I replied. "Since you've made it clear that you see that as a burden rather than a gift, I'm free to build something for myself instead." That was the last real conversation we had. He called a few more times over the following months, but the messages became shorter and less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Through my lawyer, I learned that he'd declared bankruptcy and moved across the country to take an entry-level position with a small real estate company in Portland. His wife's divorce papers were eventually served, though since they'd been married less than 24 hours and had no joint assets remaining, the process was relatively simple. As for me, I was discovering what it meant to live for myself for the first time in over 3 decades. The foundation I'd established was already funding 12 different programs, helping widowed mothers start businesses. I'd purchased a small house on the Oregon coast, 3 hours north of where my son was trying to rebuild his life, and was spending my days learning to paint watercolors and taking long walks on the beach. For the first time since I was 32 years old, I was answerable to no one but myself. It was terrifying and liberating and absolutely wonderful. 18 months after the wedding that ended my old life and began my new one, I was living in a cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean, painting sunrise scenes from my kitchen window and learning that solitude could be a choice rather than a punishment. My hair had grown back beautifully, silver waves that caught the morning light as I worked at my easel. I joined a local art group, volunteered at the animal shelter, and discovered that I actually enjoyed my own company. For 33 years, I defined myself entirely through my relationship with my son. Now I was learning who I was as just myself. The foundation had become more successful than I'd ever imagined. We'd helped over 200 women start businesses, from online boutiques to consulting firms to food trucks. Every month, I received letters from recipients telling me how the grants had changed their lives, how having that initial financial support had given them the confidence to bet on themselves. "You saved my life," one woman wrote from Colorado. "After my husband died, I thought my dreams of opening a bakery were impossible. Your foundation didn't just give me money, it gave me hope." Those letters meant more to me than any thank you card I'd ever received from my son for birthday presents or Christmas gifts. These women understood what I'd learned too late, that sometimes the people who love us most can become the people who limit us most, not through malice, but through our own willingness to sacrifice ourselves for their comfort. I was reading one such letter on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from my old hometown. "Mrs. Johnson?" The voice was female, young, nervous. "This is calling about your son. I work with him." The secretary, the woman for whom he'd been planning to abandon his marriage and flee to Switzerland. "I'm sorry to bother you," she continued, "but I wasn't sure who else to call. He's been struggling, since he moved out here, and yesterday he was in a car accident. He's in the hospital, and he asked me to contact you. I felt that familiar tug of maternal worry, the automatic response that had driven so many of my decisions over the years. But this time, I paused before answering. Is he seriously injured? I asked. Broken ribs, concussion, but he'll recover, she said. The thing is, he doesn't have anyone else. No emergency contacts, no family out here. The doctors need someone to make decisions about his care. And he's not in a good place financially to handle medical bills. Of course he wasn't. And of course, in his moment of crisis, he'd turned to the mother he'd planned to betray and abandon. What's your name? I asked. Jennifer, she said quietly. And before you ask, no, we're not together anymore. Haven't been since right after the wedding. When everything came out about what you both were planning, I realized I didn't know him at all. Both? She was referring to my son and his wife as conspirators, which suggested she hadn't been as involved in the deception as I'd assumed. You weren't part of the plan to steal my money? I asked directly. What? She sounded genuinely shocked. No, I thought he was unhappy in his marriage and planning to leave his wife for me. I had no idea about any inheritance or nursing homes or... God, is that what you think? That's what I overheard him planning, I said. There was a long silence. I swear to you, I never knew about any of that. He told me his mother was controlling and manipulative, that she was trying to prevent him from being happy. I thought I was helping him escape from an unhealthy family situation. Another woman who'd been manipulated by my son's version of events. I was beginning to see a pattern in how he presented himself as the victim of other people's unreasonable expectations, mine. His wife's? Probably Jennifer's too. Why did you break up? I asked. Because once we were together all the time, I realized he never took responsibility for anything, she said. Every problem in his life was someone else's fault. His mother was too controlling. His wife was too demanding. His boss was too critical. It took me months to understand that he sees himself as the victim in every situation, even when he's the one making the destructive choices. This young woman had figured out in months what it had taken me decades to see. What do you want me to do? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. He keeps saying you're the only family he has, that you'll come if something happens to him. But honestly, after what I've learned about how he treated you, I wouldn't blame you if you hung up right now. I looked out my window at the ocean, at the waves that had become my daily meditation, at the life I'd built from the ashes of my old one. This was the test I'd known would come eventually, the moment when I'd have to choose between the boundaries I'd established and the old patterns that had defined me for so long. Give me the hospital information, I said finally. I'll handle the medical bills and make sure he gets proper care, but tell him not to expect more than that. Are you going to come see him? She asked. No, I said, and surprised myself with how easily the word came. I'm not. 2 years after the wedding that changed everything, I was sitting on my cottage porch, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and coral, when my son appeared at my garden gate. He looked older, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the coastal highway, not expensive florist arrangements. Hello, Mom, he said quietly. I set down my paintbrush and studied his face. How did you find me? It took months, he admitted. I hired a private investigator with the last of my savings. I know you probably think that was foolish, spending money I don't have to track down someone who doesn't want to see me. Why are you here? I asked, making no move to invite him closer. To say I'm sorry, really sorry, not the self-serving apologies I gave you before. He shifted the flowers from one hand to the other. I've spent 2 years in therapy, trying to understand how I became someone who could plan to steal from his own mother and have her committed to a nursing home. And what did you discover? That I've been treating people like resources instead of human beings since I was probably 25 years old, he said. My therapist helped me see that I learned to manipulate situations to get what I wanted, and somewhere along the way, I started doing that to you too. I watched a seagull ride the wind currents above the waves, graceful and free, and thought about how long it had taken me to learn that same kind of freedom. I know you paid my hospital bills, he continued, and I know you've been sending anonymous donations to help cover my therapy costs. The counseling center told me they had a benefactor who specifically requested that I continue treatment. That had been my compromise with myself. Provide the help he needed to heal without enabling his continued dependence on me. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I don't even know if I deserve the chance to apologize in person. But I needed you to know that I understand now what I did to you, and what I lost because of my choices. What have you lost? I asked. The best mother a son could ask for, he said simply. The woman who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities I threw away because I thought I was entitled to them. The relationship that should have been the foundation of my life, which I destroyed because I was too selfish and immature to value it properly. I felt tears threaten for the first time in months. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition. Hearing my son take full accountability, without excuses or justifications, for the first time in his adult life. I'm not asking for money or help or even a relationship, he continued. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry and that I'm working every day to become someone worthy of the love you gave me for 31 years. What's your life like now? I asked. Simple. I work for a nonprofit that helps formerly homeless individuals find housing. I live in a studio apartment, drive a 15-year-old car, and I'm learning to budget like the normal person I should have learned to be years ago. He almost smiled. I'm discovering that I actually like earning things instead of having them handed to me. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the sound of waves against the rocks below my cottage. You look happy, he said eventually. Really happy, not just pretending to be okay. I am happy, I said, surprised by how true it felt. For the first time in decades, I'm living for myself instead of trying to manage other people's lives. I'm glad, he said, and his voice carried genuine warmth. You deserve happiness after everything you gave up for me. As the last light faded from the sky, my son stood to leave. These are for you, he said, placing the wildflowers on my porch step. I know they're not much, but I picked them myself on the walk here. I thought you might like them because they grow wild and free, like you're learning to do. After he left, I sat on my porch, holding those simple flowers, thinking about the journey that had brought us both to this moment. My son was finally becoming the man I'd hoped to raise, honest, accountable, able to value relationships more than resources. But that transformation had only been possible after I'd stopped enabling his worst tendencies and started protecting my own well-being. The foundation I'd established now supported over 400 women and their families. My cottage had become a gathering place for local artists and writers. I'd discovered talents and friendships I never would have found if I'd remained trapped in old patterns of sacrifice and guilt. I never did remarry or reunite with my son in any traditional sense, but occasionally, perhaps twice a year, he would visit, always respectfully, always briefly, sharing updates about his work and asking about my life without any expectation of repairing what had been broken. These conversations were pleasant but careful, the relationship of two adults who respected each other but no longer needed each other. His ex-wife, I learned through news reports, had been arrested in Florida for running an elaborate romance scam targeting elderly widowers. My son testified against her at her trial, finally taking a stand against the kind of manipulation he'd once participated in. As for me, at 67, I was finally living the life I'd never allowed myself to imagine, free from the exhausting work of managing other people's emotions, choices, and consequences. I painted watercolors that no one had to like but me. I traveled to places that interested me without considering anyone else's preferences. I donated my money to causes that mattered to me without worrying about whether my generosity was being taken for granted. I'd learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enablement, disguised as sacrifice. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices, even when that someone is your own child. My story isn't a fairy tale about reconciliation and forgiveness. It's something better. It's a story about a woman who spent 33 years defining herself through other people's needs and finally discovered that her own life was worth living for its own sake. And every morning when I wake up in my cottage by the sea, surrounded by the life I built from the ashes of betrayal, I'm reminded that it's never too late to start choosing yourself.